everyone. So essentially, intersex people are individuals whose hormones, chromosomes, and body types don't fit a typical, what we may call, male or female body. And these people aren't rare per se. They make up to 1 in 50 people in the UK, which is higher than the number of ginger people and people with green eyes. And ultimately, these individuals are subjected to what I may call a very specific type of abuse. Essentially, whilst other people in the LGBT community, we might even say, have sort of the freedom to express or choose their preferred gender, ultimately, intersex people are stripped of this right through medically unnecessary corrective surgeries. These surgeries ultimately aim to change the body types of intersex people to conform to a male or female body, and this is done to children as young as infants against their will. And these surgeries have even been likened by the UN and the World Health Organizations to other abusive practices such as female genital mutilation. And ultimately, this leaves intersex people the silent majority of the queer community, because whilst other queer people are able to, as I mentioned, relish in their true gender, intersex people don't have the opportunity to choose theirs. Instead, theirs is chosen to them by essentially a surgical scalpel. And essentially, theirs is chosen to them by a surgical scalpel. And many walk through life completely unaware of their intersex identity, with many surgeons having deprived them of this knowledge, telling the parents to sort of conceal this, what they call this shameful secret, and many intersex people only finding out about this until well into adulthood. And the sheer number of intersex people that exist in the UK makes us wonder how many are still hiding in the shadows. Now, ultimately, what's important to acknowledge when we talk about this issue is that these surgeries aren't actually predominantly performed in developing, what we may call like culturally behind countries in the global south. In fact, the countries that are most likely to pursue them or the people most likely to pursue them are living in the West right now. So take, for example, in 2015, Zimbabwe created a task force to attempt to sort of eliminate these surgeries, a practice which only one Western country, Malta, has successfully banned. And ultimately, Western nations try their best to sort of justify their complicity in what many may call these human rights abuses by arguing that these surgeries are a way to sort of save intersex people from leading a lonely life of insecurity and discrimination. Many people in the West sort of condemn the marginalization and the violence that a lot of intersex people are subjected to in the global South, for example, but simultaneously uphold these medical practices because they see removing the unconventional nature of intersex people's bodies as a sort of humane gesture to help them assimilate. Michaela Raab, for example, was a German intersex woman who, when she sued her doctors for performing surgery on her without her consent, the doctors said in court that they, as a defense, that they were merely trying to save her from the social discrimination that she would have faced had she kept her sort of her unconventional intersex body, as they described. And this all highlights how a lot of people, or suggests how a lot of people in the West view the loss of intersex people's identity as sort of a small price to pay for a lifetime of what they see as integration and not being ostracized and seen as freakish or other. However, assimilation is not acceptance, and nor has it ever been the solution. So if we take, for example, firstly, the assimilation that does come about from these surgeries does not guarantee the great quality of life that a lot of these Western nations are claiming it does. For example, a lot of intersex people who do undergo surgery, a lot of them still face routine discrimination, as well as the additional trauma of potentially developing a gender that doesn't align with the sex they were assigned during surgery. But even disregarding this and assuming that these surgeries are able to give intersex people the wonderful, good quality of life that they dream of, ultimately, they still, at the end of the day, place society, parents, and ultimately society's discomforted feelings and concerns and prejudices about intersex people above the child's welfare. Take, for example, a lot of anti-LGBT people try to disguise their prejudice and opposition to the queer community as a sort of preservation attempt to uphold science and what they call facts over feelings, a very common term that's been used. But ultimately, I would incredibly question that, because surely forcing an intersex child with an otherwise natural body to conform to an otherwise unnatural and artificial idea of what the normal or standard body should look like, isn't that the epitome of prioritizing feelings, in this case society's feelings regarding intersex people, above facts, or in the facts as well as, most importantly, the child's welfare? When has assimilation ever been the answer to oppression? Do we demand to this extent that therefore gay people should try to hide their sexuality to avoid discrimination? And if you say no, then I question why we should subject intersex people to the same type of conforming, for example. For a society that frankly places society's feelings above the child's welfare, needs to critically rethink its concern for children. Now, that being said, you people watching this right now might question, well, what can I do in my everyday life to try to prevent this? Like, I'm a small individual compared to a big government that has the power to actually reform these laws and change them and get rid of these non-consensual surgeries. But I believe that you as an individual can do a lot, and I urge you as an individual to question the ideas that you have about consent. Because I say this because I believe that the way we talk and look at consent with regards to children is incredibly important to trying to tackle this issue of these surgeries. And the reason being is that the way we talk about consent, especially in schools, is predominantly limited to consent in sex, for example, and sex ed. And that means that what's left a lot out of these discussions is ultimately how consent relates to children and their personal boundaries. For example, there were a variety of studies have shown that a lot of parents have never asked their children if they were comfortable with physical contact. And this spurred the UK government in 2018 to introduce consent classes in schools for children, to teach children as young as 4 about personal boundaries. And ultimately, these in classes spurred backlash amongst a lot of parents who saw them as an attempt by the government to try to police, what they say, police the way they were raising their children. And ultimately, this does suggest that a lot of parents sort of don't see or understand the importance of children learning about personal boundaries and consent. And the reason why that is incredibly important when we're talking about surgeries on intersex minors is that children who grow up to think that ultimately consent is non-essential, that take, for example, if a parent or a relative cooks for them, brings them a gift, that they're entitled to a hug or physical contact that the child would otherwise not want, or that the child isn't entitled to their own personal boundaries, however young, these children will go on to become adults who condone these surgeries, lawmakers who uphold them, and surgeons who perform them. This issue of these surgeries is inextricably linked to a culture that sort of trivializes the idea of consent in children, erases children's agency over their body, and assumes parents, the government, and doctors complete control over it. That being said, I urge everyone watching this right now to question their ideas about consent, maybe potentially try to change old patterns with how you interact with with children, how you teach them about personal boundaries that before you would have seen as harmless, but now you understand may send the wrong message. Because I believe that whilst the government sure has loads of power to reform these surgeries, I believe that it's only through us as individuals to create small patterns and actions in our everyday lives that we can truly tackle this large issue. Thank you so much for listening.